The frozen winds of the northern territories howled through the jagged peaks surrounding Darkbringer Keep, carrying the bitter scent of oncoming winter. Outside, the night was a void of endless black, save for the pale, ghostly light of the full moon filtering through heavy storm clouds. Inside the grand fortress, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating scent of roasted meat, spilt ale, and the overwhelming, oppressive aura of hundreds of dominant wolves. It was the night of the Great Hunt celebration, an annual display of raw power and dominance for the Bloodflare Pack. At the very end of the massive obsidian timber table, farthest from the warmth of the roaring hearth, sat Nyx. She sat perfectly still, her slender hands folded neatly over her lap. Her long silver-white hair cascaded down her shoulders like starlight, framing a face of delicate, ethereal beauty. But her eyes, wide, clear, and completely pale, stared blankly into the distance. She was blind, an Omega, born into a pack that valued nothing but physical strength and martial dominance. To the rest of the Bloodflare Pack, she was nothing more than a fragile shadow, an invisible servant who existed on the fringes of their glorious empire. They did not know the truth. They could not possibly comprehend that this quiet, unseeing woman was the earthly incarnation of the moon goddess herself. Having descended from the celestial realms to walk among her creations, testing the hearts and loyalty of the wolves who claimed to revere her name. At the absolute head of the long table sat Kalen, the arrogant alpha king of the Bloodflare Pack. His broad shoulders were draped in heavy, dark furs, and his golden eyes gleamed with absolute hubris and unchallenged authority. Every movement he made radiated supreme entitlement. He was a king who had never known defeat, ruling over 17 conquered packs through sheer terror and brute force. To his right sat a glamorous diplomatic envoy from the Eastern Packs, laughing loudly at his arrogant boasts and pressing her body against his side. "My Alpha," the Eastern envoy purred, her voice dripping with calculated flattery. "Your victory over the Northern Ridge is the stuff of legends. No other Alpha could have broken their lines so effortlessly." Kalen threw his head back, his deep, booming laugh echoing off the high stone walls of the throne room. The sound carried the complete confidence of a man who believed the entire universe revolved around his bloodline. It was a simple matter of genetic superiority, Kalen declared, his voice cutting through the chatter of the 300 wolves in attendance. "The Bloodflare line is built on pure warrior blood. We do not tolerate weakness, nor do we compromise with those who cannot hold a blade or hunt in the trenches." As he spoke, his golden eyes drifted down the long expanse of the obsidian table, finally landing on the quiet, pale figure of Nyx. The warmth instantly drained from his expression, replaced by a cold, sneering contempt. He looked at his fated mate, not with love or protection, but with profound embarrassment. To an arrogant king like Kalen, having a blind Omega as a destined partner was a cruel joke played by the heavens, a permanent stain on his flawless reputation. Nyx felt the sudden weight of his heavy, hostile gaze across the room. Even without sight, her divine senses mapping the world in ripples of pure energy and emotion, She could feel the absolute rejection radiating from his soul. The sacred bond between them, which should have been a source of warmth and ultimate unity, felt like a frayed, freezing thread pulling tight against her heart. The grand feast continued for hours, a performative display of loud dominance and clashing tankards. Throughout it all, Nyx remained silent, a ghost at her own mate's table. She remembered a time, years ago, when Kalen had been a different man. She remembered a winter storm when they were younger, before the crown had fully consumed his mind with arrogance. He had found her in the lower libraries, shivering over ancient texts, and he had wrapped his heavy cloak around her shoulders. In that brief, unshielded moment, he had whispered that her mind saw things his eyes could never catch. That single memory had been the anchor that kept her by his side, enduring the isolation, quietly weaving the legal agreements and political frameworks that stabilized his chaotic rule from behind the scenes.
But tonight, that anchor finally snapped.
When the feast drew to a close, Kalen stood up, slamming his heavy silver chalice onto the table. The entire hall fell dead silent. The musicians stopped playing, and the wolves turned their eyes toward their supreme leader. "Elders of the council," Kalen announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "A true king requires a queen who can stand beside him in battle, one who can breed a generation of ruthless conquerors. The blood flare pack cannot be dragged down by broken bloodlines." He pointed a finger directly at Nyx. Branthor, the head pack official, stood up from the elders' table, his expression grave. Branthor had always been a meticulous man, a professional who handled the official decrees of the realm. He held a piece of heavy parchment in his hands, his eyes darting nervously between the Alpha King and the blind Omega.
"Your Majesty," Branthor stammered, his voice tight. "Are you certain of this decree? The ancient laws of the bond state that—"
"The ancient laws do not rule this pack. I do," Kalen interrupted, his aura flaring wildly, suffocating the lesser wolves in the room. "I hereby reject Nyx as my mate and banish her from the blood flare territories. She is an Omega, a blind, useless weight that defiles our warrior legacy. She leaves tonight, stripped of all titles and pack protection. Branthor, draft the reference letter for her expulsion. Let her find sanctuary in the wastes if she can survive the night." A collective murmur rippled through the grand hall. Some looked away in shame, while others sneered openly at the rejected Omega. Nyx slowly stood up from her chair. Her movements were graceful, entirely devoid of the panic or desperation Kalen expected to see. She did not beg. She did not cry out. She simply stood before the assembly, her pale, blind eyes directed toward the throne. "You speak of warrior blood and legacy, Kalen," Nyx said, her voice quiet, but carrying a strange, resonant power that seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the stone keep. But authority built entirely on pride and stolen foundations is a fragile thing. You cast away what you do not understand. "Silence, woman," Kalen roared, his golden eyes flashing with sudden rage. "You have no power here. Your words are nothing but the desperate cries of a discarded parasite. Leave my sight before I force my warriors to drag you into the snow." Nyx did not answer.
A single perfect tear slipped from her pale eye, tracking down her cheek. As that tear fell, hitting the cold stone floor of Darkbringer Keep, an invisible tremor rippled through the spiritual fabric of the world. The divine test had concluded, and mankind had failed utterly. She turned her back on the Alpha King, her dark cloak swirling around her ankles as she walked toward the massive iron doors of the Great Hall. No one stopped her. Branthor stepped forward, his face pale as he handed her a rolled parchment, a formal letter of transition. A cold professional courtesy, signaling her absolute severance from the pack she had secretly protected for 5 long years. As the heavy iron doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her out into the raging winter storm. The golden firelight of Darkbringer Keep seemed to instantly lose its warmth. Nyx walked into the freezing downpour, the cold rain soaking through her dark cloak and plastering her silver hair against her skin. She clutched the ancient scrolls of her personal writings to her chest, her pale eyes looking up at the hidden moon above the clouds. With every step she took away from the pack borders, the divine grace that had protected the Bloodflare line for generations began to unravel. The punishment of the goddess had begun. Inside the throne room, the atmosphere changed in a fraction of a second. Kaelin, still standing proudly at the head of the table, suddenly gasped. A violent, agonizing spasm ripped through his chest, forcing him down to his knees. The silver chalice fell from his hand, clattering against the obsidian timber. "Alpha!" Branthor shouted, rushing forward as the other elders panicked. "What is happening?" Kaelin could not speak. The primal, roaring spirit of his inner wolf, the very source of his supreme strength, speed, and alpha authority, was suddenly thrashing in absolute terror inside his mind. It felt as though an invisible divine hand was reaching into his soul, tearing the predatory spirit away from his human flesh. He tried to summon his claws, tried to let out a dominant roar to quell his sudden agony, but nothing came. Across the room, loud cries of horror broke out among the warriors. The high-ranking alphas of the pack were collapsing one by one, clutching their chests as their majestic auras vanished into thin air. "My wolf! I can't feel my wolf!" A seasoned war commander screamed, staring at his hands in sheer panic. Kaelin forced himself to stand, his legs shaking violently. He tried to shift, trying to summon the massive, black-furred beast that had terrified 17 packs. But there was nothing but a hollow, agonizing void inside him. The divine bond had been severed, and with its departure, the curse had taken root. Every single alpha in the Bloodflare Empire had lost the ability to transform. Their strength was fading, their predatory instincts dying, leaving them as nothing more than ordinary, fragile humans, dressed in the furs of wolves. The arrogant king looked out at his crumbling empire in the fading light of the hearth, a terrifying realization slowly sinking into his chest. He had banished a blind Omega, completely unaware that he had just evicted the ruler of the heavens from his home. Meanwhile, miles away from the cursed lands of the Bloodflare pack, the storm began to clear. Nyx walked through the dense forest, her footsteps light and unburdened despite her lack of physical sight. The trees seemed to part for her, their branches bowing in silent reverence to the deity walking beneath them. By the time the early morning light began to break over the horizon, she reached the outer boundaries of the Silver Reach Alliance, a rival northern territory known for its intellectual appreciation and balanced governance. Waiting at the border post was Alethra, a loyal companion and prominent official of the Silver Reach. Alethra stepped forward, her eyes widening as she recognized the ethereal grace of the approaching woman. She did not see a discarded, weak Omega. She recognized the immense, quiet brilliance that had guided the region's politics for years. "My Luna," Alethra said, bowing her head deeply in a gesture of profound respect. "Welcome to Reach Hall. We have been waiting for you. Your sanctuary is prepared, and your position as the Blood Seal Arbiter is fully recognized by our council." Nyx stopped, letting the warmth of the morning sun wash over her pale face. The melancholic weight of her past life was still present, but beneath it lay an unshakable, divine resolve. "Thank you, Alethra," Nyx replied, her voice soft, yet carrying the undeniable authority of a queen reclaiming her throne. "Let the old empire fade in their own pride. It is time to build something that lasts." The heavy obsidian tray felt like a leaden anchor in Nyx's delicate, slender hands. She stood entirely motionless in the dim, stone-walled corridor just outside the heavy oak doors of the High War Council chamber. Her head slightly tilted, though her sightless eyes were veiled by the milky calmness of her permanent blindness. Her other senses were extraordinarily sharp, capturing the subtle shifts in the air and the resonant vibrations of the voices filtering through the thick wood. The voice she heard speaking belonged to Kaelin, the arrogant Alpha King of the Bloodflare Pack, her fated mate. The man for whom she had spent 5 agonizing, unacknowledged years sacrificing her peace to build a thriving empire. Beside him stood an ambitious female envoy from the Eastern Territories, a manipulative climber whose tone dripped with an artificial warmth that was constructed rather than genuinely felt. Much like a house built of stolen timber rather than grown from the earth. Nyx held her breath as the cruel words drifted through the gap in the heavy door. They were discussing the formal dissolution of their sacred mating bond, a devastating rejection that Nyx had long anticipated. Over the past several months, she had slowly and meticulously prepared her heart, transforming herself into a woman who had already accounted for the coming storm. The fracturing of their bond had stopped being a terrifying surprise and had instead become a predictable countdown. However, what her brilliant mind had not accounted for was the second, more insidious part of their conversation. The ambitious female envoy's voice cut through the darkness of the hallway, outlining a treacherous plan. She suggested that after the bond dissolution was formalized, Kaelin should make a formal Void Speaker declaration before the Grand Council. She mentioned that an elder from a neighboring faction had already been approached to facilitate the process. A Void Speaker was the oldest, most degrading designation in ancient pack law, reserved strictly for mated wolves, whose bonds were dissolved under public accusations of mental instability, madness, or deep dishonor. The testimony of a Void Speaker carried absolutely no weight before the elders. Their words were permitted to be heard, but they were never recorded in the sacred ledgers. They were physically present, but entirely stripped of legal and political power. Nyx realized the horrific depth of Kalen's treachery. If she were officially declared a void speaker before she could step forward to reveal the truth, her voice would be instantly erased. Before she could expose the hidden subterranean chamber where she had labored in absolute darkness, before she could claim credit for the 5 years of ceaseless work on the intricate blood seal system, and before she could reveal that her unseen hand had drafted every single treaty and cipher that held 17 pacts together, it would all dissolve into thin air. The word of a broken, blind void speaker against the majestic, absolute word of an alpha king was not a fair contest. It was a terrifying silence, shaped like a contest. Then she heard Kalen's voice. It was measured, pragmatic, and entirely devoid of anger, which made the betrayal feel unspeakably worse. He stated coldly that there was an isolated wellness retreat located 2 territories to the north. He described it as very comfortable, but entirely permanent, noting that a void speaker placed in residence there would be a voice that reached no one. When the female envoy inquired whether Nyx might cause any unexpected difficulties before the formal declaration could be filed with the council, there was a brief, horrifying silence. Kalen simply replied that she never had before. The tray grew impossibly heavy. Nyx turned away from the door with absolute grace and composure. She carried the heavy silver tray to the nearest stone window ledge, setting it down without making a single sound. For one long, solitary moment, she stood before the open window, letting the cold autumn wind brush against her pale, sightless face. She listened intently to the training yard below, hearing the rhythmic clashing of longswords and the rough shouts of the blood flare warriors. In that exact moment, she felt something entirely unexpected. She had prepared herself for overwhelming grief, and she had prepared herself for burning rage. Both emotions were certainly present, smoldering like 2 low fires in a distant, abandoned room of her mind. But they were not the loudest things inside her. The loudest thing within her was absolute, terrifying clarity. It was the specific, immutable clarity that arrives only when every remaining door has been closed against you from the outside, leaving you with no choice but to build a door for yourself. Nyx was not merely a rejected, blind Omega. Beneath her fragile mortal shell lay the hidden, primordial essence of the moon goddess herself, the deep, resonant voice of an American woman who had descended to this earth in human guise to test the hearts, the humility, and the honor of the werewolf race. Kalen had failed the divine test utterly, blinded by his own supreme arrogance and his foolish belief that her blindness tainted the pure warrior bloodline of his pack. With a heart hardened into divine iron, Nyx walked silently through the twisting corridors of Darkbringer Keep until she reached her secret, unmapped subterranean chamber in the East Wing. She sat at her heavy wooden desk and unrolled a fresh sheet of crisp parchment. With the exact same focused precision she had always used to manage territorial laws and intricate bond notations, she began to plan her escape. In 5 years of managing an empire's logistics, she had never once made a single mathematical or tactical error, and she did not intend to start now. That very evening, she quietly summoned a loyal, quiet young maidservant to her hidden sanctuary. She did not reveal the full scope of her divine nature or her ultimate destination, but she provided enough detail to secure her aid. Nyx asked 3 seemingly small, separate questions in a calm, even voice. She requested the exact rotation schedule of the guards at the eastern gate. She asked for the precise delivery window of an old, trustworthy scroll merchant who made his weekly supply runs to the fortress. Finally, she asked whether any member of the royal household could see the east-facing window of her hidden chamber from the garden paths below. The young maidservant answered each question faithfully, her voice trembling slightly in the quiet room. She sat silently for a moment, looking at the blind woman who had been the true, secret architect of their kingdom's prosperity, and asked how much time they had left. Nyx looked in her direction and stated calmly that they had 16 days, possibly less. The maidservant did not flinch or weep. She refrained from asking the dozens of reasonable questions spinning in her mind, and instead reached across the desk to gently push a warm cup of herbal tea into Nyx's hand. Nyx took a slow sip, feeling the warmth spread through her. The maidservant firmly stated that she was coming with her, but Nyx shook her head with gentle finality. She explained that if they fled together, the council would immediately realize the maidservant was complicit. Nyx commanded her to stay, to claim she saw absolutely nothing unusual, and promised that when the time was safe and her new sanctuary was established, she would send for her. The maidservant nodded in silent obedience. Later that night, under the faint light of a single flickering candle, Nyx unrolled the authentic blood seal scrolls from their hidden iron vault. She had secretly copied the intricate vault seal configuration from the estate maintenance records 2 years prior, allowing her to spread the genuine, priceless foundational treaties across her desk without alerting anyone. Her slender fingertips traced the complex, raised notations on the aged parchment. These were patterns that only her highly sophisticated mind could navigate, featuring a deeply layered, protective encoding she had personally engineered during a brutal winter storm years ago. She remembered that night vividly, when Kaelin had dropped a mountain of crumbling, disorganized documents on her desk, desperately begging her to save his fractured authority before the spring thaw. She thought about the ancient library. She thought about the howling wind outside. She remembered the rare moment of vulnerability when Kaelin had whispered that she saw the vital things he completely missed. It was a bitter irony that the very man who had uttered those words had just calmly discussed the permanent erasure of her voice with the same cold detachment he used to plan bloody battle strategies. Nyx rolled the scrolls back up, tying them with sturdy twine. She sat in the absolute darkness for exactly 1 minute, letting the silence wrap around her like a protective cloak. Then she relit her candle and returned to her tireless work. Over the next several weeks, she would need to construct a flawless decoy, a perfect physically duplicate of the sacred documents. Her brilliant mind already knew exactly how to build it. The annual Great Hunt Feast was the oldest, most revered tradition of the Blood Flare Pack. Every year, on the first deeply freezing night of autumn, the entire population gathered in the grand hall of Darkbringer Keep. Over 300 powerful wolves, dressed in their finest furs and leathers, filling the air with the thunderous sounds of traditional drums carved with ancient patterns. The great stone hearth blazed magnificently from sundown to sunrise, casting a roaring, a fiery glow that could be seen for miles through the pitch-black forest. It was undisputedly the loudest, most chaotic night in the keep's calendar. And it was the exact night Nyx had selected from the very beginning of her planning. She knew that no one looks for what is quietly leaving when everyone else is boisterously celebrating what remains. She made her appearance at the commencement of the evening, dressed in a modest, elegant gown of deep forest green, as she always did. She navigated the crowded hall with effortless grace, pausing to exchange polite, warm words with the gentle wife of Branthor, a kind-hearted official who genuinely cared for Nyx's well-being. Nyx responded with authentic warmth, appreciating the rare kindness in a court filled with wolves who viewed her as a useless, broken ornament. She forced herself to eat 3 small bites of the roasted venison during the first course, waiting patiently for the perfect moment. Exactly 20 minutes into the feast, Nyx delicately pressed her fingertips to her temple, creating a small, highly visible gesture of physical distress. She quietly excused herself from the high table, whispering to the attendants that she was suffering from a sudden low fever. The words flowed effortlessly from her lips. Over the past 5 years, she had used slight variations of this excuse dozens of times, and not a single soul had ever thought to question her. The blind Luna's quiet, sudden absences from long, rowdy social evenings were considered one of the most reliable, unremarkable features of life at Darkbringer Keep. The court simply believed the narrative that she was a delicate, private creature, easily overwhelmed by loud noises and large crowds. She ascended the grand stone staircase, but she did not return to her bedchambers. Instead, she slipped silently into the east wing of the fortress. The sacred Blood Seal Vault was located at the far end of a secluded corridor on the 2nd level, a restricted area that Kaelin had strictly designated as off-limits to all household staff after dark since the very first year of his arrogant reign. It was his own absolute rule, never questioned by his subjects. Nyx had always privately noted that men with nothing to hide do not create arbitrary rules about which corridors may be walked and when. She did not carry a lamp, having no need for light in a world she navigated entirely by memory and touch. She moved through the deep shadows like a ghost, memorizing the placement of every single flagstone and the slight irregularities in the ancient floor. She knew the exact weight required for each step to ensure that a loose wooden board near the 3rd wall sconce would not creak and announce her presence. Her breathing remained slow, even, and perfectly controlled, while her hands were entirely steady. Beneath her feet, the thunderous vibrations of the feast drums rumbled through the massive stone foundations of the castle. The vault seal was protected by a complex 7-point bond notation mechanism. Its access code was derived directly from the primary Blood Seal protocol, a system Nyx had completely rebuilt during the 2nd year of their mating bond. Kaelin only understood the surface code, the simple, functional outer layer of the mechanism's architecture that she had deliberately shown him. He was completely ignorant of the fact that a far deeper, more secure layer of coding existed beneath it. Nyx had never mentioned it to him, knowing that a woman who rebuilds a lock must always keep a secret master key that no one else can copy. The heavy vault door glided open without making a single sound. Nyx reached her slender hand into the darkness, her sensitive fingers instantly locating the authentic blood seal scrolls. They felt heavy, their edges worn smooth from years of her meticulous handling. Laden with the immense weight of the treaties they contained and the absolute authority they proved. She lifted them out with reverence, carefully placing her highly detailed decoy scrolls in their exact position. It had taken her weeks of intense, covert labor to construct these decoys, utilizing aged parchment sourced through 3 completely separate, untraceable transactions arranged by the old scroll merchant. She had spent hours filling the columns with elegant, entirely meaningless symbols written in an ink she had personally aged over a low flame until it perfectly matched the original documents. Every physical detail, from the texture of the leather ties to the weight of the parchment, was flawlessly identical. However, on the very first inner page of the primary decoy scroll, she had written 2 words in a handwriting she took great pains to make slightly distinct from her ordinary script. I am free. She closed the vault door and reactivated the complex seal. Standing in the freezing, dark corridor, she pressed the authentic blood seal scrolls tightly against her chest, feeling the old parchment rustle against her gown. 3 floors below, the frantic rolls of the feast drums reached their absolute peak, marking the celebratory climax of the evening when every wolf in the hall was completely consumed by mead and laughter. Nyx turned and walked away from her old life. She slipped down a narrow servants' passage at the rear of the keep, which opened directly onto a desolate stone courtyard connecting to the kitchen gardens. Beyond the low garden wall lay the dark, dense tree line of the eastern forest. The perimeter of the royal estate was guarded by a massive stone wall, broken only by 3 heavy iron gates. 2 of those gates were heavily staffed by elite warriors at all hours of the day and night. However, the 3rd gate, a small auxiliary exit that opened onto a forgotten forest path leading to an old pack road 2 miles north, had been left entirely unattended for the past 3 years. This was because Nyx herself had submitted a comprehensive revised security assessment 14 months ago, recommending the strategic reallocation of guard positions to the heavily vulnerable front approach. She had chosen this exact night 14 months ago, realizing that the abandoned Eastern Gate would one day serve as her door to freedom. She moved silently through the courtyard in the pitch-black darkness, hugging the inner stone wall and ensuring that every single step landed on the soft, wet autumn grass rather than the loud, crunching gravel. A steady, freezing rain had begun to fall from the heavens, its rhythmic pattering drowning out any sound she might make. She reached the iron mechanism panel of the eastern gate and lifted the heavy metal latch. Her fingers moved swiftly across the cold notation positions in the dark, reading each contact point by touch and memory. Navigating the intricate pattern she had permanently encoded into her muscle memory through years of repetition. The gate's release configuration had been subtly recalibrated 6 weeks prior, during what the royal records listed as a routine structural inspection. She had performed the recalibration herself at midday, entirely alone, in under 4 minutes. The heavy iron gate groaned softly as it swung open just wide enough for her slender frame to slip through. Suddenly, she heard a guard's rough voice echoing from a stone overhang to her left. The warrior was sheltering from the freezing rain, trading lazy words with a companion about the magnificent feast happening inside. Praising the warmth of the grand hall, the sweetness of the royal mead, and the inspiring nature of Kalen's arrogant speech. The other guard let out a low laugh, but neither man moved from their warm, dry spot. Nyx froze against the cold stone wall, pressing one flat palm against the iron gate to prevent it from swinging any further. She stood perfectly still, her breath slow and shallow as the icy rain soaked through her green gown. She waited with divine patience as the guards continued their mindless chatter. Finally, one of them stepped away to gather another log for their small fire. In that brief moment of shuffling and distraction, Nyx stepped through the gap and pulled the iron gate precisely back into its resting position without a sound. On the other side of the wall lay the endless black forest, loud with the sound of rushing wind and torrential rain. Nyx did not light an oil lamp. She navigated the treacherous terrain using a flawless mental map she had constructed from old estate survey documents. Papers she had processed and filed for 5 years without Kalen ever bothering to ask what they contained. 2 miles north, at an old stone mile marker, a hired carriage was waiting for her at exactly midnight. The arrangement had been coordinated through a complex chain of 3 separate intermediaries who did not know each other's names. Managed entirely by the trustworthy old scroll merchant. She walked through the mud, holding the oilcloth-wrapped scrolls tightly against her body to protect them from the downpour. Behind her, through the thick canopy of trees, the warm amber glow of Darkbringer Keep's massive bonfires was still visible, a distant blur against the black sky. The fortress stood there, burning and indifferent, entirely unaware that the brilliant mind holding its entire political structure together was currently walking away into the dark forest. Nyx did not turn her head to look back at it. Her lack of a backward glance was not because the departure wasn't difficult, but because she had already looked at that toxic kingdom from every conceivable angle, in every light, for 5 long years. She knew exactly what it was, and she knew exactly what it was not. She turned her face toward the open road and continued walking. The freezing rain came down around her in sheets, steady and patient, but it did not matter to her. She reached the old stone mile marker at exactly 7 minutes before midnight. The black carriage was already waiting in the shadows. The driver was a quiet, older wolf named Kale, an individual with the dull, incurious eyes of a man who had long ago learned that minding his own business kept him comfortable and alive. He had been paid an immense sum of gold to understand that asking 0 questions was the absolute foundation of their arrangement. Without uttering a single word, Kale opened the wooden carriage door. Nyx climbed into the dry interior, sinking back against the worn leather seat. She placed the heavy blood seal scrolls securely in her lap and rested her slender hands over them. Outside, the rain continued to pour, steady, patient, and entirely on her side. The carriage began to move, its wheels churning through the thick mud as it headed north. Nyx closed her sightless eyes and inhaled one long, slow, unhurried breath, the first relaxed breath she had taken in 16 agonizing days. In the quiet sanctuary behind her closed eyes, in the absolute darkness behind her blindness, she held herself perfectly still. For the first time in 5 years, the silence she existed inside belonged entirely to her. There were no arrogant footsteps echoing overhead, no distant, mocking laughter carrying through thick stone walls, no empty mornings filled with invisible dispatches, and no stolen credit signed in someone else's name. There was only the sound of the rain, the steady rocking of the road, and the sacred scrolls resting safely in her lap. Nyx was finally traveling toward a destiny she had chosen for herself, toward a sanctuary she had built at last. She did not cry. She had not shed a single tear during the 16 days of planning, and she did not weep now. What she allowed herself in the rocking darkness of that carriage was something far deeper, quieter, and more complete than tears. She allowed herself to simply exist, unheld, unobserved, and unburdened by the performance of being a perfect, submissive mate. The carriage continued its journey north, crossing the official border of the Blood Flare Pack. As the wheels crossed the boundary line, a single crystal tear finally escaped Nyx's sightless eyes, falling gently onto the oilcloth wrapping of the scrolls. The moment that tear fell, a profound, supernatural shudder rippled silently through the very earth beneath them. It was a silent, divine declaration. The moon goddess had officially abandoned the Blood Flare Pack, and with her departure, a terrible, an unprecedented curse was instantly unleashed upon the land. The following morning, Kaelin, the arrogant Alpha King, awoke with the sluggish satisfaction of a ruler who had eaten magnificently and drunk deeply at his grand feast. He lay in the center of his massive, luxurious bed, his piercing gold eyes tracking the pale morning light filtering through the high windows. He stretched out in the easy, thoughtless comfort of an absolute monarch whose world was perfectly arranged for his convenience. He dressed himself without any sense of urgency, throwing a heavy fur cloak over his broad shoulders before making his way down to the High War Council chamber. He fully expected to find what he always found on the mornings following a long celebration. The vital dispatches translated, the complex political analyses neatly written out, and the clear, flawless strategic recommendations laid out in the small, precise handwriting that always appeared on his desk without him ever having to ask. However, as he stepped into the war chamber, he was greeted by absolute silence. The massive obsidian desk was completely empty. Kaelin stood frozen in the center of the quiet room, processing the bare wooden surface the way a man processes a missing step in the dark, experiencing a sudden lurch of confusion before fully understanding what has happened. He quickly categorized the absence as a minor, manageable domestic issue and sent a guard to summon the maidservant. The young maidservant arrived shortly after, her face a mask of absolute composure, having spent the entire night practicing how to stand perfectly still before her terrifying king. With a steady voice, she informed the Alpha King that the Luna's private chambers had been found entirely unoccupied at dawn. She noted that several simple items of clothing were missing from the wardrobes, and most importantly, the silver-threaded hair comb that belonged to Nyx's mother, the one given to her on the morning of their bonding ceremony, was gone from the dressing table. Kaelin stood in the stone corridor outside the chamber, absorbing the shocking information for exactly 4 seconds. Then, a sudden wave of panic washed over him. He turned on his heel and marched toward the east wing at a frantic pace. He did not care about the disappearance of his blind mate, but the scrolls were the only thing that truly mattered. The entire political and legal architecture of his empire lived within those ancient blood-sealed documents. If she had dared to touch them, his rule would be shattered. He arrived at the heavy iron vault and quickly entered his surface access code. The mechanism released with a heavy click, and he swung the door open. He let out a long, relieved exhale as he saw the leather-wrapped scrolls resting neatly on the shelf. He picked up the top scroll, unrolling it to inspect the complex notation columns. They appeared immaculate, complex, and entirely as they should be. He convinced himself that the weight of the parchment was correct, the ink looked right, and that everything was perfectly fine. He rolled the document back up and marched into the morning council session with his full, arrogant authority deployed. He stood before Branthor and the assembled war elders, confidently presenting a strategic summary of the ongoing territorial dispute on the northern ridge. However, his speech was incredibly vague and filled with sweeping generalizations. Without the decoded, meticulous analysis that Nix usually left on his desk, Kalen realized he had absolutely no idea how to interpret the raw data himself, having never once decoded a complex diplomatic dispatch in 5 years of ruling. He managed to stumble through the meeting, relying on his powerful presence and loud, commanding voice, because that had always been the arrangement. The incredibly difficult intellectual work was always magically resolved before he arrived, leaving him only to sign his grand name to the finished result. From across the long obsidian table, Branthor watched the Alpha King with a deeply perceptive, critical eye. The veteran elder noticed how Kalen's confident summary landed wide of what the raw dispatches actually indicated, spotting the glaring omissions and the subtle errors that would only be visible to someone who was quietly paying attention. Branthor folded his weathered hands on the table, staring at nothing in particular, and remained completely silent. However, a burning question that had been forming in his mind for months had just crystallized into a heavy, undeniable truth. 4 days after the feast, a formal, high-stakes boundary dispute erupted along the northern ridge, requiring the council to cross-reference the ancient vault scrolls against the official Pack land surveys. Kalen gathered the scrolls and retreated to his private study, spreading the documents across the large desk to begin the cross-reference himself. As he compared the texts, he realized that something was completely misaligned. He frowned, checking the figures a second time, but the numbers made absolutely no sense. He pulled a second scroll from the bundle, frantically checking the notations. The measurements were entirely wrong. They were not wrong in the manner of a simple scribe's error. They were wrong in the way a completely foreign language he did not speak was being rendered in a handwriting that merely looked correct. Panic seizing his chest, Kalen unrolled the innermost scroll last, turning frantically to the very first page. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes landed on 2 words written in a script that was almost, but not quite, Nix's. "I am free." A choked, horrifying sound escaped Kalen's throat before he could even finish exhaling. It was not the magnificent, terrifying roar of an alpha king. It was something far smaller, weaker, and more terrifyingly honest. It was the sound of a proud man whose entire majestic architecture had just revealed its foundation to be a total illusion. He realized in one brutal moment that his throne had been built entirely on the stolen intellectual genius of the blind woman he had so ruthlessly despised and planned to discard. In a fit of absolute blinding rage, Kalen threw his massive fist directly into the solid stone wall of his study. He stood alone in the quiet corridor of his grand fortress, his knuckles bleeding profusely and his chest heaving wildly as he stared at the shattered stone hole he had made. For the very first time in his adult life, the proud Alpha King had absolutely no idea what to do next. He was completely lost, tactically, politically, and emotionally. He stood there in the silence, a helpless child masquerading as a king. The ambitious female envoy arrived at the keep the following morning, carrying herself with a composed, warm expression and the practical intelligence of a woman who understood how to manage what was visible to the public. She sat across from Kalen at the long council table, from which Branthor and all the other elders had quietly excused themselves to avoid the king's volatile temper. She immediately began offering smooth, polished narratives to salvage the situation. She suggested making a formal pack-wide announcement, claiming the Luna had been struck down by a sudden, severe illness. Or perhaps framing her departure as a necessary journey to a northern sanctuary for a prolonged period of rest. She was genuinely skilled at creating pretty stories to preserve the smooth surface of royal politics. However, what she was completely unequipped for was the complex reality hidden beneath that surface. She possessed absolutely no understanding of the functioning infrastructure of the Pack's political authority, or the highly encoded language that bound 17 powerful territories in sacred legal obligation. She had foolishly believed that the true power resided entirely within Kalen's fearsome physical presence. Having never had a reason to understand where the Alpha King's authority actually came from, Kalen looked at her across the empty table, his gold eyes filled with an icy, desperate expression she had never seen before. He asked her in a low, quiet whisper if she could read the complex bond notations on the scrolls. The female envoy smiled carefully, claiming she possessed a familiar understanding of the Eastern Ridge systems, and confidently uttered a technical legal term. The moment the word left her mouth, Kalen's heart sank. The term she used was completely wrong. It was not a slight mispronunciation, it was categorically, fundamentally incorrect. It was the kind of egregious error that told him instantly that the ambitious woman sitting before him had been leaning entirely on the shallow appearance of shared authority rather than its true. A complex substance. The true substance of his empire had just walked out through his eastern gate into the freezing rain 4 days ago. Kalen said nothing for a long, agonizing moment. He slowly turned his head to stare at the empty space on his desk, where the beautifully decoded dispatches used to miraculously appear every morning. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room was its own terrifying answer. Realizing that her opportunity for power had evaporated, the ambitious female envoy left the keep that very afternoon. She packed her luxurious belongings with the cold, The efficient composure of a woman who understands that political associations are valued strictly by what they can offer. And this particular alliance had run completely dry. In her haste, she left behind a single earring, a cheap red glass drop, resting on the dressing room ledge. Kaylin found it later that evening, tossing it carelessly into a dark drawer, never to look at it again. 3 weeks of agonizing uncertainty passed before Kaylin's elite scouts finally returned to Darkbringer Keep. Their official report was brief and devastating. They explained that they had tracked her trail directly to the border of the rival Northern Territory, the Silver Reach Alliance, where it had abruptly stopped. It had not gone cold in the traditional sense. It had stopped in the specific, unyielding way a trail ends when the person at the end of it is fully protected by an unassailable sovereign power. The scouts revealed that the blind woman they were hunting had been granted formal, high-ranking standing under the Silver Reach Alliance, officially recognized as the Blood Seal Arbiter. She was being heavily shielded by the sovereign authority of Elithra, a fierce and loyal companion of the Northern Alliance. But the part of the report that sat heaviest in Kaylin's gut, threatening to choke him, was the revelation that she was being protected by the exact border accords he himself had proudly ratified 4 years ago. They were the highly sophisticated, airtight accords that Nyx had written every single provision of. Agreements she apparently knew entirely by heart, ensuring that he could never legally send an army to reclaim her without triggering a massive multi-pack war. Kaylin stood alone by his study window, reading the devastating report as the autumn leaves slowly let go of the trees outside, falling to the cold earth in that quiet, patient way things let go when their season has reached its absolute end. He stood completely still, his bleeding knuckles now healed into ugly scars. He thought about the small, faint scar on Nyx's palm, a mark she had gotten while frantically organizing his messy archives. He remembered the way she used to sit quietly at the very end of the grand feast tables, her sightless eyes calmly watching the flickering candle flames while she held her wine goblet, never reacting to the insults, never performing for the court, just existing in her quiet brilliance. He thought about the ancient library during that terrible winter storm, the heavy cloak draped over her frail shoulders, and the 4 words he had meant completely at the time, but had somehow, over 5 years of arrogant hubris, utterly failed to honor in any way that mattered. You see things I miss. The grand hall of Darkbringer Keep was deathly quiet that evening. The massive fireplace had burned down to a few dying gray coals, and the festive drums were completely silent. Kaylin, the arrogant Alpha King, sat entirely alone in his massive stone chair at the head of the long, empty obsidian table. The hollow hall stretched out into the darkness in both directions, offering no performance for him to give. No adoring audience waiting to cheer his name, and absolutely nothing left for him to inherit. Now, there was only the cold, brutal truth of a magnificent room that had always been far louder than the brilliant, invisible mind that ran it. Now, both the room and the kingdom were completely still, balanced on the precipice of a terrifying ruin they were entirely unprepared to face. Meanwhile, far to the north, the beautiful territory of the Silver Reach Alliance began exactly where the harsh blood flare borderlands ended. The two kingdoms were separated by a breathtaking ridge of silver birch hills, which in the peak of autumn were nothing short of a magnificent masterpiece of nature. The hills were filled with pale, elegant tree trunks, vibrant gold leaves, and a soft, the ethereal quality of light that felt entirely different from the harsh, oppressive atmosphere of Kalen's fortress. The light here felt softer, truer, and infinitely more honest, as though the very land itself had a beautiful secret to share and had finally found the perfect, peaceful way to say it. Nyx's carriage finally arrived at the grand gates of Reach Hall on the 4th day of her journey. She had carefully changed carriages twice along the way, and spent one quiet night resting at a secluded wayside inn under a false name, ensuring that no one could track her movements. She was exhausted, feeling a deep, bone-weary tiredness that only comes to an individual who has been running on absolute precision and adrenaline for weeks, and has not yet given her body permission to feel the true weight of her exhaustion. Her elegant forest green dress was heavily creased from the long journey, and the hem was damp and stained with dark mud from her escape through the rain. As the carriage door opened, Alethra stepped forward into the crisp morning light. She was a loyal, fierce companion of the Silver Reach Alliance, possessing a keen mind and an unmatched respect for true brilliance. She did not see a discarded, weak, sightless Omega stepping out of the vehicle. She instantly recognized the immense, quiet genius that had secretly guided the entire region's politics and kept 17 packs from tearing each other apart for half a decade. Alethra bowed her head deeply, a gesture of profound, unyielding respect that Nyx had never once received in her 5 years at Kalen's court. She addressed her warmly as her Luna, welcoming her to Reach Hall. She informed Nyx that they had been waiting for her arrival with great anticipation, reassuring her that her private sanctuary was fully prepared and her prestigious position as the High Blood Seal Arbiter was completely recognized and honored by their sovereign council. Nyx paused on the carriage step, lifting her pale face to let the gentle warmth of the morning sun wash over her sightless eyes. The melancholic weight of her past life, the memories of Kalen's cruel betrayal, and the pain of her unappreciated sacrifices were still very much present within her heart. However, beneath that heavy mortal sorrow lay an unshakable, terrifyingly powerful divine resolve. The moon goddess was finally waking up within her vessel, ready to watch the arrogant wolves who had scorned her tear themselves apart in their own hubris. Nyx turned her face toward Alethra, her voice soft and melodious, yet carrying the undeniable, absolute authority of a primordial queen reclaiming her eternal throne. She thanked her companion, stating that it was time to let the old, arrogant empire fade away in the ashes of their own pride. She stepped firmly onto the soil of the Silver Reach, declaring that it was finally time to build something beautiful, something true, and something that would last for eternity. The heavy oak doors of Reach Hall groaned as they parted, admitting a cold gust of wind that made the torches flicker violently along the stone corridor. Nyx stepped across the threshold, her footsteps light and deliberate, entirely devoid of the hesitation that usually accompanied the footsteps of the blind. She no longer wore the drab, stained garments of a discarded Omega. Her silver hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, free from the crude bone pins she had been forced to wear in the South. Under her arm, she carried the authentic blood seal scrolls, the foundational documents of the Northern Territories. Holding them not with the anxiety of a thief, but with the calm assurance of an author reclaiming her work. Elithra walked a half-step behind her, her hand resting near the hilt of her blade, her eyes scanning the grand gallery with vigilant loyalty. Reach Hall was not designed for the loud, ostentatious displays of raw power that defined the architecture of the Bloodflare Pack. There were no massive trophy skulls lining the high rafters, nor were there rivers of spilled ale staining the floorboards. Instead, the fortress was a monument to structural intelligence and organized serenity. Vast libraries occupied more space than the feasting commons, and the scent of old vellum and dried lavender filled the crisp air. For the first time in many winters, Nyx felt the soothing embrace of a sanctuary that had been built by individuals who respected the quiet weight of authority rather than the loud theater of dominance. A commanding middle-aged woman, heavily built and possessing the unshakable stillness of a seasoned commander who had long since ceased needing to prove her strength, received them in a private chamber. She wore no ceremonial armor, yet she occupied the room the way a mountain occupies a landscape, offering no apology for her existence. The crackle of the hearth fire illuminated the sharp lines of her weathered face as she observed Nyx for a long, silent interval. It was the calculating look of one leader measuring another, searching for the precise boundary where myth ended and reality began. The commander leaned back against her heavy timber desk, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a honed blade. She remarked that the exiled companion of the Bloodflare sovereign was either the most exceptional mind to cross her threshold in 2 decades or a catastrophic geopolitical entanglement, adding that a single inquiry would reveal the truth. She then posed a highly technical question regarding the mathematical encoding of the ancient blood seal notation system. A query so deeply specific to the layered ciphers that it could never be answered by someone who had merely studied the texts from afar. Nyx did not hesitate. Guided by Elithra, she approached the desk, picked up a fresh quill, and began to write on a clean sheet of parchment. Though her physical eyes saw nothing but darkness, her hand moved with infallible precision, the scratch of the nib loud in the silent room. Within 4 minutes, she demonstrated the core interpretive method, uncovered 3 critical structural vulnerabilities that had existed in the ancient design for generations, and laid out the flawless corrections she had implemented in her revised version. She wrote in the efficient shorthand of someone for whom the work was not a performance to be praised, but a fundamental instinct. The commanding woman read the parchment in absolute silence, her gaze lingering on the ink for a long time. A faint, almost imperceptible tilt appeared at the corner of her mouth, the expression of an experienced ruler who had found exactly what she was seeking, without allowing herself to display astonishment. The commander observed that the Bloodflare lineage had always struck her as an enterprise whose dominion rested entirely upon a foundation it lacked the intelligence to describe. With absolute composure, Nyx replied that she was in a position to confirm that assessment. The alliance they forged required no theatrical oaths or grand ceremonies. Nyx was officially designated as the Blood Seal Arbiter and High Intelligence Counsel to the Silver Reach Alliance, a position that granted her full standing, an absolute voice, and comprehensive legal immunity under the very border covenants that Kaylin had ratified and Nyx herself had drafted. In return, the Silver Reach gained exclusive access to the only complete and authentic Blood Seal infrastructure in the known territories. The very system that 17 individual packs currently operated under in good faith, foolishly believing the authority resided in the Bloodflare bloodline. The revelation of where that true authority had always been held was about to become a matter of devastating political consequence. Nyx was allocated a suite of chambers in the quiet east wing of Reach Hall. The rooms were modest, but they possessed a wide window that looked out over the pale, striking expanse of the Silver Birch Ridge, a view far superior to the high, suffocating stone walls of her former prison. A sturdy oak desk was provided, along with an endless supply of beeswax candles that hissed softly as they burned. Within a week, the desk was completely buried under mountains of parchment, and her inkwell was never permitted to dry. The blind Omega, whom the arrogant court ladies in their crimson dresses had mocked as a useless decoration at the great hunt feast, was now constructing an empire that belonged solely to herself. She cast aside the remaining garments of her old life, choosing to wear only flowing silks of deep silver. The essence of the labor had not changed, for the meticulous creation of systems that preserved order was her eternal nature. But the meaning of the work had been transformed entirely. Every decree she signed now bore her own name, and every strategic analysis she submitted was publicly credited to its rightful author. When the commanding woman introduced her to the High Council as their supreme arbiter, she looked at no one in particular, presenting the title as an indisputable fact rather than a charitable restoration. Nyx accepted it with quiet dignity, offering no performative expressions of gratitude. She simply worked, allowing the perfection of her output to serve as her sole announcement to the world. One evening, 3 weeks into her tenure at Reach Hall, Nyx sat before a blank sheet of parchment while the winter wind howled against the glass. For a brief moment, her thoughts drifted southward to Kaylin. She did not think of the arrogant Alpha King who filled rooms with his loud laughter and performative confidence. The man who took up vast spaces without ever asking permission. Instead, she remembered the rare, fleeting glimpses of the partner he might have been. She recalled a bitter winter storm years ago when she had fallen asleep over territorial maps in a freezing study, and he had silently draped his heavy fur cloak over her shoulders, murmuring words of genuine appreciation for her mind. She remembered the first year of their fated bond, when he would occasionally knock on her chamber door and wait for her permission to enter, acknowledging that the space belonged to her. She remembered how he had once sat beside her, reading an entire security accord from beginning to end, asking questions that arose from a true desire to comprehend her genius, rather than a desire to flatter her. She wondered briefly if that man still existed beneath the hollow shell of the tyrant who had recently cast her out into the snow, screaming that a blind Omega was a curse upon his warrior lineage. She wondered if a faded love, once genuine, left a lingering warmth beneath the ashes of pride. Something that could be coaxed back into a flame if the person merely chose to stop performing and begin truly looking.
She had spent 5 years waiting for him to make that choice. Nix picked up her quill, held it suspended over the blank page, and then slowly set it back down. She would not write the letter. She had years of words stored within her heart, 5 years of unacknowledged sacrifices, cold tea,
and the agonizing loneliness of lying beside a mate who had ceased to see her. But the letter she wanted to write was for a man who had never truly existed outside of her own hopes. She was finished mourning a phantom. She was finished pouring her divine essence into a vessel that could only hold entitlement. The foundation of the empire had chosen to become visible, and it would no longer bear the name of a thief. She picked up her quill and turned back to the complex border treaties of the Silver Reach, leaving the blank page to be used by Alethra the following morning for a mundane supply list. A secret missive arrived a few days later, delivered not through the official emissaries, but via a private courier network Nix had established years prior. The letter was from Branthor, the loyal household professional who had remained at Darkbreaker Keep. Branthor was writing in absolute secrecy, completely without Kaelin's authorization. The message was sparse and heavy with grim truth. He wrote that the Grand Council was collapsing under the weight of questions they could not answer without her guidance. The pack was not merely faltering, it was unraveling from the inside out. Branthor wrote that they had all been blind, living under the illusion of Kaelin's inherited brilliance, while never looking closely at the invisible architect who was actually managing their survival. He did not beg her to return, for he knew her resolve was absolute, but he reminded her that whenever she chose to step through a door, it should be a door of her own making. Nix folded the letter and placed it securely in her drawer. She looked out the window toward the silver birch ridge, where the last of the autumn gold was being stripped away by the freezing air. She murmured softly into the empty room that her future would indeed be entirely her own, a faint, knowing smile playing upon her lips. As the months passed, the true weight of the divine curse began to manifest across the Bloodflare territories. The moment Nix had shed her mortal tears and walked away from her fated bond, the ancient judgment of the moon goddess had settled upon the arrogant wolves. It began silently. Kaelin awoke one morning to find the primal connection to his beast severed. When he attempted to summon his wolf, he met only a cold, hollow void. Within weeks, the affliction spread to every dominant alpha within his bloodline. The terrifying power that had allowed them to terrorize the neighboring packs was completely gone. They were trapped in their human forms, fragile and stripped of their predatory instincts. While the devastating full moon approached, bringing with it the threat of an annihilating territory war with the lawless Eastern Ridge packs. 6 months after the disastrous Great Hunt Feast, a formal diplomatic encampment was erected in the neutral meadow separating the Silver Reach from the Bloodflare borders. The Silver Reach standards fluttered in the freezing wind, flanked by a disciplined line of armored guards. 3 days prior, Branthor had received a letter at the gates of Darkbreaker Keep, written in the flawless, a complex blood seal notation that only Nix could command. Kaelin had spent hours staring at the document in his dim study, unable to decipher a single character. He had summoned every scribe and elder in the territory, but none could crack the base interpretive layer that Nyx had kept locked within her own mind. The letter was an ultimatum, delivered with cold courtesy, summoning him to the border for a final negotiation.
On the morning of the council, Kalen dressed with agonizing care, desperately layering himself in his full royal regalia. His medals pinned in precise order, his jaw set in a rigid imitation of the dominance he no longer possessed. The carriage ride to the meadow lasted 30 minutes, and he used every second to piece together the shattered fragments of his confidence, attempting to project the aura of the king his people still expected him to be. When Kalen stepped into the grand negotiation tent, he arranged his useless papers and waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard her footsteps before the tent flap even moved, recognizing the rhythmic cadence that had echoed through his stone corridors for 5 years. The flap parted, and Nyx walked into the room. She was magnificent, draped in heavy silver silks that caught the ambient light like stardust. Her hair was gathered in a crown of quiet formality, and her posture carried the absolute authority of a sovereign who ruled by divine right. She no longer wore her reading lenses, and though her sightless eyes looked straight ahead, there was a terrifying, primordial power radiating from her presence. She sat across from him, her clear, composed face proving that this confrontation cost her absolutely nothing. She opened her leather case and slid the authentic blood seal scrolls onto the table between them. The silence inside the tent was suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the iron braziers. Kalen stared at the scrolls, then looked up at Nyx, his face twisting with a complex mixture of sudden recognition, profound shame, and the agonizing dawn of an understanding he could no longer escape. The intricate political calculations he had spent 6 months devising, the strategy where he would frame her return as a benevolent reconciliation, dissolved into dust within his throat. He spoke her name first, his voice cracking, stripped of its royal resonance, sounding exactly as it had in the library during the winter storm. He begged her to come home, stating that the pack was desperate, that he finally understood the magnitude of what he had taken for granted, and that everything would be different if she returned. He meant it, with the desperate sincerity of a man who realized his empire was burning to the ground. Nyx placed her delicate hand flat upon the scrolls. Her voice was like ice, cutting through his pleas as she told him that he could keep the physical scrolls. For he had never truly needed the parchment. He had needed the divine mind that interpreted them, and that mind would never return to his side. She slid the documents closer to him. Kalen unrolled one with a trembling hand, staring at the immaculate, intricate columns of notation, realizing with absolute horror that he was looking at a language he could never hope to comprehend. The entire structure of his borrowed authority had evaporated, leaving him utterly exposed. The terms of the treaty she presented were not vindictive, for Nyx had not designed them to punish out of petty malice. They were designed to be accurate, reflecting the true distribution of intellectual and political power. The disputed borderlands were permanently ceded to the Silver Reach. The Bloodflare Pact's independent dominion over the 17 allied pacts was entirely dissolved, restructured under the comprehensive oversight of the Silver Reach Alliance. Kalen's pack would retain its name, its lands, and its domestic traditions. but its regional sovereignty was surrendered forever to the mind they had scorned.
Kalen signed the parchment, his hand shaking despite his desperate efforts to remain steady. Branthor stood at the edge of the tent, witnessing the signature with the expression of a man who had foreseen this cataclysmic conclusion a long time ago. Kalthos Grimbreaker, the observant war elder who had accompanied them, looked at the signature and then at Nyx. His long-held suspicions of Kalen's intellectual fraudulence finally confirmed with absolute certainty. As Kalen set down the quill, he looked at Nyx one final time, his eyes wide with a raw, unmanaged vulnerability. He whispered a desperate question, asking if any of it had ever been real, referencing the winter nights, the shared cloak, and the 5 years she had spent giving her quiet, steady devotion to a man who had treated her like a servant. Nyx closed her document case and stood up, her silver gown shimmering in the dim light. She replied that the faded bond had been entirely real, as had the flawless work she had placed under his chamber door every single morning so he could step into the world and play the part of a brilliant king. She told him that what he chose to do with that devastating realization was now his own burden to bear. She turned and walked out of the pavilion, her footsteps steady as she moved across the frost-bitten grass toward the waiting carriage of the Silver Reach. The cold winter air brushed against her face, and she did not look back. There was nothing left to mourn. She had already endured her grief alone in the hidden, dark chambers of Kalen's fortress, while he celebrated his stolen victories above. The Bloodflare pack did not immediately vanish from the maps, for empty titles often outlive the power that created them. Kalen retained his stone keep, his polished metals, and his seat at the head of the great obsidian table. But his invitations to the Grand Councils grew fewer with each passing season, and he never spoke of military strategy again. The ancient grandfather drums still beat on festive nights, but the grand halls were quiet, hollowed out by the absolute absence of the goddess who had once preserved them. 6 weeks after her departure, a maintenance worker finally discovered the secret subterranean chamber in the east wing of Darkbreaker Keep. The door stood wide open, the room completely empty, save for the faint, lingering fragrance of wolfsbane candles and ancient parchment. It was a silent declaration of a presence that had held up the entire kingdom before vanishing into the light. In the warmth of the east wing of Reach Hall, a single lamp burned late into the winter nights. The wide desk was covered in new, flourishing treaties and territorial ciphers from the 17 packs, all of which now bore the official public seal of Nyx, the blood seal arbiter of the North. Beside her sat a fresh pot of steaming tea and her new silver-rimmed reading lenses, while her old green dresses remained untouched at the bottom of her wardrobe, kept only as a reminder of the mortal sorrow she had overcome. Nyx leaned back from her desk, listening to the crisp winter wind rustling through the bare branches of the silver birch ridge. She picked up her porcelain cup, took a slow, deliberate sip of the warm tea, and allowed a small, private smile to touch her lips. It was the smile of a creator who had looked upon a chaotic world, dismantled the structures of the arrogant, and built an eternal kingdom of absolute truth. The lamp burned steady and bright into the darkness, casting its protective light over a future that belonged completely to her. The ink dried upon the parchment, But this time, the signature bore her true name. Every treaty, every territorial decree, and every law governing the northern reaches carried the undeniable mark of Nyx, the blind Omega, who was now revealed as the supreme divinity. Her authority was no longer hidden in the shadows of an ungrateful mate. It was absolute, binding, and celebrated across the continent. Meanwhile, far to the south, the grand hall of Darkbringer Keep felt cavernous and frozen. Kaelin sat upon his obsidian throne, a ruined monarch stripped of his pride and his beast. The crown upon his brow felt heavy, a useless piece of gold now that his wolf was gone, severed by the divine decree of the mate he had so brutally cast aside. Outside the east wing, the secret subterranean chamber sat entirely vacant. The candles had long burned down to cold wax, and the dust settled over the empty desk where the invisible architect of his empire had once labored. It was a room that had held 5 years of silent devotion, a brilliant mind, and a love that the arrogant Alpha King had trampled upon without a second thought. In the dead of night, Kaelin would stare into the dying embers of the hearth, haunted by the memory of the winter storm when he had falsely promised to cherish her mind. He understood his error now, but understanding brought no salvation. The curse remained absolute. As the drums of the Bloodflare pack echoed hollowly into the dark, the profound, aching silence of her absence kept its patience with him, waiting like a slow executioner for the proud king to be fully broken by his own regrets.